ensuring that everything was in order. It was a quiet night, and he found himself growing bored. However, that all changed when he stumbled upon a group of people performing a strange ritual. At first, Carlos thought they were just teenagers messing around. But as he got closer, he saw that they were performing witchcraft. He could feel a sense of unease growing within him, but he brushed it off and continued his patrol. As the night wore on, strange things began to happen. Shadows moved on their own, objects were misplaced, and eerie noises echoed through the cemetery. Carlos tried to convince himself that it was all in his head, but the feeling of unease only grew stronger. On one particularly stormy night, Carlos was patrolling the grounds when he heard a blood-curdling scream coming from one of the mausoleums. He ran towards